Anything else we didn't hit upon?
You know, one of the things I'd like to say about healthcare is that in relation to employment, it's not equal for everyone. And one of the things that we've seen lately, at least with our organization, is having to train, and we always come in after, right? People get sued, and then they call us and say, can we do a diversity training? Because it's always a part of the law. So I said, okay, yeah. But we're having to train HR, departments, and saying, you have to provide trans folks health care. And that question is coming because there are corporations who say, I don't think we should have to give trans folks health care, because if we can kick them out of the military because we don't believe in providing health care for them in the military, then why should our organization or why should corporate America have to give trans folks health care? And so now we see, of course, this huge disparity with LGBT folks, especially trans folks, in their access to health care. And if they don't have access to health care, that affects everything in their life.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and what's scary about that is that means that that's just a person who we know is not getting access to the health care that they need, who has voluntarily or involuntarily been outed at work and ended up in some kind of lawsuit in order to get their health care. Yeah. And there are just countless numbers of other folks who have not come, I don't say haven't come forward, but who we don't know about, who are suffering equally.
Yeah. I mean, do you think there's something legislatively that can be done to counteract that?
I think this is a great example of one of those things that certainly there are legislative solutions, but it's a much broader issue and a much broader question of getting people to start thinking of trans people as people, and to
Imagine.
I know, I know, and to have that in mind the moment they sit down to underwrite their insurance policy, the moment they sit down to write their employee handbook, whether it's a government organization or a large corporation. And sure, from the legislature, we can require that every employee handbook have this clause, or we can require that every insurance plan have this this provision, but that's just a stopgap. What we want to do is start changing hearts and minds so that we don't have to come in and do that.
And get back, to your thing, though, because I'm thinking about, like, where are the workers in these sort of locations, right? Like in the hierarchy of work, and who's actually doing the underwriting, right? And what does it mean to have multiple people at the table, right? Because I think about, we talk about it a lot in academia, about worldviews, right? About what it is that I have been required to look at and not, and also been fortunate or privileged enough to miss, right? And if I've never had to have a conversation with LGBTQ folk, LGBTQ plus folk, or about them, then I'm not excusing anything, but just sort of pointing out the fact how easy it would be to not think about underwriting certain groups of people. It's not in my thought process, right? So what does it mean to put different folks in different spaces, to have different kinds of conversations, to think about different worldviews? I think we occupy very different worlds often, even as we walk right by each other on an everyday basis.
I mean, how do we do that? I mean, that's
tough conversations.
We force it. We force it, and it's something I think as activists, you know, like when marriage equality went through, and we were all partying, and that's great. We couldn't become complacent. There were so many other things to do. We have to keep pushing it, and because it's so funny when they set these goals that, like, you know, in 2021 we're gonna have 50% females, and we still need to keep pushing it. Right. You know, I love what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said about how many Supreme Court justices should be female, and she said all of them, because it's been male for so long. Why not? Why can't we look at this as that should be a goal?
Well, even again, going back to the last session, so AB 99 was a bill to incorporate a policy that would require foster parents to have training around LGBTQ plus youth. We have seen that across the state that's not happening. Right. And so different counties, Department of Family Services is supposed to be monitoring that. That's not happening. Right. A number of the foster care agencies at the county level are not implementing the training, or they show up and they don't participate. They congregate in the corner and have conversations among themselves, or they wear apparel that says they don't want to participate. And so we've seen time and time again where you can implement the policy, but how do you change the hearts and minds? And therein lies the hurdle. And ultimately, people have to come to understand that we are all the same, and approach, you know, their interactions with everyone that way.
And Todd, I guess that's the question. When you have somebody that's literally wearing clothing that opposes what you're talking about, how do you get them to the table to have a healthy conversation that you can still share.
Well, you go ahead. You go.
I can't speak for everyone, right? But I'm one of those people that don't necessarily believe that I have to change everyone's mind about sort of things, right? I'm one of those people that's like, look, you don't have to like me.
Yeah.
That's your loss. You know, I feel like I'm a really fantastic person, that's in my humble opinion, right?
Yeah.
But I think you cannot destroy my livability.
Yeah.
And those are fundamentally two different things, right? What does it mean to not like someone versus harm their livability and their viability in this world are functionally different things. But to answer the question, I think there are multiple strategies that we can employ, and clearly there are laws. Clearly activists work, and often activist work turn into laws, right? My students are activists who work both in public sectors, who work in the universities and in local communities. But I also think that there's ways in which we could think about how do we, and this sounds weird to me every time I sort of say this out loud, but I think about how to make people see it in different kinds of ways versus, you know, I want people to see people as people. That's the bare thing for me. But I'm also thinking about, like, when folks don't have access to health care, that harms the public. And it's a different kind of conversation, right? Because it forces people to always remain selfish. But I wonder if that's sometimes a necessary step. Certainly not always, because that would be an ugly way to move and progress through the world. But I wonder if that's sometimes.
Well, I would like to say about when we're looking at training, because of my job, right? So I go in there. The first thing I say when I'm talking to a group of people, whether it's mandatory or they've made the choice to come in and go to a diversity training, things like that, is that my job is not to change ideology. That we often are raised with these thoughts of what sex and gender and being gay is, and all of these things. And for a lot of folks, I think this is very divisive. Yes. Divisive conversations, right? So my job isn't to convince you that you have to love every LGBT person and be a fan of Ellen and do all of this. My job is to make sure that when you clock into work, that you don't discriminate based on that ideology, because you can be fired for that. And so I'm just simply giving you I'm gonna give you some terminology, I'm gonna teach you about pronouns, I'll give you the history of oppression as to why my community is a little upset sometimes about, and how my community reacts to you being that way. And a lot of times when I talk about AB99, that it was kind of a mess because they aren't doing the trainings. The capacity isn't there to do those trainings.
Or the funding.
And the funding isn't there to do that. And so for those of us who do trainings, we can't just show up. I always say, like, I'm like a vampire on the outside of a house. You have to invite me inside the house. And once I'm in there, like, I'm gonna do a training, it's gonna be great, and hopefully we can change some hearts and minds. But that has to be built right. And I don't think a lot of times that those systems are built correctly, because those systems are pretty much built by cisgender, heterosexual, white privileged folks. And so they really don't have this want to have people come in there and change people's ideology.
Systems that are built over centuries, right?
Oh,
so
yeah, for sure,
I often
for
think
sure.
about why we think a day workshop will fix what we built over centuries. It's odd to me that we think that that's going to happen, right? Like, I teach courses on this stuff, on gender and sexuality often, and I do get folks who are in the back of my class the whole time going, and you're like, okay, I have to talk to this person, right? And sometimes it takes 10 weeks to even ship. Sometimes I never solve. Sometimes we don't get anywhere because it takes longer, right? Because ideologies are deep rooted, and often a weekend workshop or a 2-day workshop or whatever it is that we're doing isn't gonna be it. I think we have to commit resources, and resources in both time and money, if we are honest about really wanting to create change.
Yeah, definitely.